Rick. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's exciting to have such a big and diverse and geographically spread out group of people joining us for today's webinar. What we'll be doing today is talking about innovation and how that's changed and what it's going to look like in the future, and particularly how we believe that to innovate in the future, corporations will learn to innovate more like a VC. So on the agenda today, we'll discuss why corporate innovation has to change, why CEO involvement is so important, the 5 steps to innovating like a VC for corporate leaders, what works and what doesn't in the world of startup partnerships and investments, and where leaders like yourselves can get started. So a little bit about me. So as Patrick said, I am Director of Innovation and Partnerships at 500 Startups. And what you should know about me is I come to this discussion and this conversation with a unique vantage point. So I have been in the field of corporate innovation. I have been an entrepreneur. I have been an entrepreneur with my own startup. I have been a management consultant, and I have been a designer. And so I have worn a number of hats and seen things from different directions. And of course, now work in venture capital. And I think stitching together those experiences and understanding how challenging all of those different roles and positions in the market can be is what I'd like to reflect on today. So I'd like to also know a little bit about who you are in your organization. So we're going to conduct a quick poll, and Patrick's going to ask you all to submit a response.
All right, it should be up for everyone to see now.
I think we've got it.
Wow.
So wait a little bit longer for everyone to vote. All right, what do we have here?
Here we also looks like the majority of people are innovation leaders. We got quite a lot of consultants, about 28% consultants, 31% innovation leaders, 15% C-suite, a little bit of R&D at 8%, a few number of designers at 2%, and then we have 3% ballers, shot callers. So
excellent, and a wonderful distribution of people, and that helps us also think about who you are as an audience, and we'll try and make sure to hit on themes that are no doubt important to all of you. So a little bit about who we are, though, as 500 Startups. For those who aren't familiar, 500 Startups has the mission to discover and back the world's most talented entrepreneurs, help them create successful companies at scale, and build thriving global ecosystems. That last part is a little bit unique as far as most venture capital firms are concerned, because we do have this twin mission to help find the next centers of innovation, of startups, and where the best founders are, far from Silicon Valley, even though that's where we're based. So we are headquartered in San Francisco, and we've become the world's leading growth-focused accelerator and seed stage investor. And according to PwC's most recent Money Tree report, we're the most active VC firm of for globally. And that's reflected, of course, in the footprint we have, the primary geographies, as well as countries we've invested, and certainly through our network of different kinds of funds and people we have on the ground in different markets, we're able to reach in founders and invest in them globally. What does that look like? A quick summary of 500 by the numbers. So we have 2,210 portfolio companies as of 2018, and we've invested in 74 countries. We have 10 unicorns in our portfolio. You can see some of their logos here across a number of different sectors, from fintech to enterprise software to e-commerce and in various markets. And we have $454 million in committed capital across 19 funds. And so far, we've produced 24 seed accelerator batches. So certainly we know a thing or two and have a certain velocity and breadth of the kinds of deals, startups, and companies that we deal with across different geographies. So a question for all of you is, where are you on your company's innovation journey? So another quick poll here to get a sense of where you are. So if we pop that up, Patrick.
Okay, should be up, ready to go.
Awesome. Where do you stand, in your opinion, today?
Well, we're about 60% of everyone has responded, and it looks like most people are just starting or a few years in. In third place, we do have some seasoned pros, which is good. And then a few are starting over, and a smaller amount are not really innovating at this point. For the does using sticky notes for wallpaper count, we have 2 responses confirming that they do in fact use sticky notes for wallpaper.
Very economical choice. Thanks everyone for voting so quickly. That's very helpful to know, and certainly we'll tailor this conversation to be for folks who are in the early phases and no doubt experiencing some of the initial heartburn of what it's like to really approach innovation. And for the seasoned pros, we'll expect a few new things in here, I think, for them too, as well as an opportunity to ask lots of questions towards the end. So, corporate innovation. Sounds like everyone is talking about it, so everyone must be doing it. Turns out everyone's trying, but they're not necessarily successful. So what's going wrong here? Well, something significant happened by 2018, and that is the very real threat of digital became quite pronounced. And for large incumbents in 2018, digital strategy stopped being about doing things that were trendy and started becoming very real and a very critical matter for their businesses. That was something that everyone caught on to, certainly the non-tech press as well, as you see in this Economist story. And what we know, therefore, is that conventional firms have to approach big tech, and they have to think about the threat of startups and maybe even partner with them. So what do we mean when we talk about this disruptive force coming from digital or coming from startups? Well, disruption, of course, is where we typically characterize a small company with few resources is able to successfully challenge the Goliath here and establish its own business and in the face of a powerful incumbent. And the reason that happens, as we know from the sort of canon of the innovator's dilemma, is that, you know, as incumbents focus on improving their products and services for the most demanding, best customers, they exceed the needs of some segments, ignore some others, and that creates an opening in the market for a disruptive player. Certainly, there are other ways in which people have used the word disruption and still use the word disruption. It can mean anything from exponential technologies. It can also mean the replacement of a market failure with something new and different. But this is generally what we, of course, still mean when we talk about disruption. But while that is a technical definition, what does disruption feel like? Well, disruption feels like a lot of uncomfortable change. And certainly that's where we are right now, is we're feeling great discomfort with the advent of digital. And this is 10 years after the creation of the iPhone, and where we saw just a few years afterwards a spike in the increase of the smartphone, and in reference to the mobile phone, and of course that in reference to landlines. And just that acceleration of change and that pace of change is probably what we're feeling, no matter how we choose to define things. So if corporates are getting this picture, what are they doing about it right now? We published a research paper, white paper with INSEAD on how do the world's biggest companies deal with the startup revolution. And what we know is that corporates are already engaging with and funding startups. So 68% of top companies from the Forbes Global 500 are engaging with startups right now. And 61% of unicorns have raised from at least one corporate investor. And that is a good sign, certainly, but it's very concentrated in a handful of companies that have figured out how to invest. And certainly the nature of the engagement with startups is pretty unequal. Some companies are doing it better, others are struggling, and certainly there is room for improvement. So why is this so hard, and what does it look like? Well, we can think of Uber and the taxi industry, and certainly for a long time, people looked at Uber and thought of it as disruptive to taxis, to individual or small businesses that of course, were disrupted by this marketplace. But while the taxis thought that they could hide behind some sort of regulatory protection, that wasn't true for them, and it's not true for folks in established companies. But what's also true is how it's easy to misunderstand what a startup could be or might be. And for the companies that are facing the Ubers of the world, they don't realize how it's changing the entire mobility game, how we're going to move from a world of buying cars to one of buying rides, how we're going to consume food that differently as it's delivered to us, how in other parts of the world, the rideshare industry is also a purveyor of financial services. And on and on. And so the breadth and reach of this disruption and convergence of technologies that sometimes come behind it can allow us to misunderstand exactly what's going to happen, and perhaps not see the forest from the trees, and not be ready for that really fast pace that comes with how disruption feels. And that's where your CEO comes in. The CEO has a really important job here, and that is to bring people together around a challenge. And without that kind of senior level engagement, you don't get successful innovation projects. You don't have a coherent strategy. You don't establish the strategic intent, whether it is fear or greed or pride or something else. You don't get that in a strong way to reflect the direction that the company needs to go. And even with a highly ambiguous problem, which might not have a single clear direction, if you don't have the CEO's involvement, we don't get the challenge clearly defined. So what do you do in the face of that challenge? Well, we propose 5 steps to innovate like a VC. And this is how most venture capitalists approach their management of their fund, really dumbed down or simplified to 5 important things that you absolutely must do. There are plenty of things beyond this, but this is the essence. So first of all, have an investment thesis. So that means you need to have insights. You've got to know something that others don't, either about your industry or how the world is going to be different. Maybe there's a number of mega trends. Maybe there's some big waves. How are you going to catch those waves and when? Second, a portfolio approach. You've got to have many different bets. And that is essential because we're trained in the world of business strategy to think about making a single decisive choice, picking the option that's up and to the right, when in fact we are dealing often with a future that is highly ambiguous, and we need to take a portfolio approach in order to be successful. So the next thing you need to do is have a pipeline and have great deal flow. Certainly at 500, with the number of companies we invest in and the thousands more that apply to our accelerator program or that we, for whatever reason, don't invest in directly, we have an emphasis on having high velocity of deal flow and of course across different markets. And being able to source that is really key. And companies that have looked to add that as a competency or partner with others that can do that for them and be a force multiplier are able to find the solutions or the possibilities that they're looking for. Fourth, you've got to create an unfair competitive advantage for your portfolio companies. And that means you've got to reduce the technical risk, reduce the market risk, help make sure the right team comes together, hire the right management team. And when you do that, that helps to improve the chances and the outcomes. And then fifth, and this might seem counterintuitive, is the idea of an exit. So you may be actually trying to time a financial return or trying to transform the growth story of your own business. And in that case, you've got to have an idea of what success looks like at the other end and be rigorous in how you measure yourself along the way in your innovation approaches. And so bringing all this together, there has to be a sense that this takes time. You've got to treat it as an ongoing process. It's not one and done. And certainly there is a portfolio approach here. I'm going to double click a little on that because the biggest hurdle to an organization running a innovation program, and this applies for a fund too, is knowing that this is a process of experimentation. And when you can place a lot of little bets and double down on your winners, that can be a really successful approach. So many of you know venture capital firms will reserve part of their fund to invest or follow on in their successful companies. And that's kind of how it is from these little bets, is you've got to have a systematic portfolio-based approach that will help you quickly decide which startups and businesses are going to be worth integrating to the business. Let's say it's not even one that you've invested in, but it could be a project that you've decided to sponsor or do a proof of concept with and so forth. And that counts too, in terms of just having a sense of starting small and having a vision later for integration or for what the uptake looks like. That balanced approach for a portfolio does take time. But while it seems like venture is about investing into the distant future, not everything has to be a Horizon 3 possibility. In fact, we believe that a portfolio also includes distribution across things that are core, adjacent, and transformational. So an example is how Alphabet has made a range of bets around the future of mobility. And we can think about, to the core of that, how Google acquired Waze some years ago and used it to improve Google Maps. More adjacent, there was the acquisition of Android. And while that was certainly to provide an operating system for mobile phones, the offshoot of that has also been development of things like Android Auto for car companies. And then finally, transformation, the creation of Waymo, a separate business unit, and an autonomous vehicle program that brings together a number of different technologies, and of course, was incubated internally. So some ideas about what works and what doesn't in the world of startup partnerships and investments. Our thinking is that you've got to develop your innovation approach through strategy and alignment. That, of course, helps when you have that very senior level buy-in that we talked about. But while it seems that you would bring senior people to the table to make a huge decision or a huge investment, you counterintuitively want to start off with small bets. Then you've got to meet with specific startups near and far. There are a lot of great ideas outside the four walls of your company. For some, that's meant setting up shop in Silicon Valley, but it could also be in other technology hubs. Certainly, we're big believers in that, and use that opportunity to solve some business challenges. Once you prove the relevance and the value of that, it's much easier to bring your organization along. Thirdly, find some tangible examples of disruption that can inform your leadership teams, and find some good ventures to back. So as people in the organization get more insight, develop a perspective, and then feel more and more invested behind good ventures, external and also internal, there can be a sense that disruption is something that we can take a hold of in our organization, in our business, and be able to harness and have a portfolio of options around, as well as a portfolio of traditional investments. Fourth, develop a thesis of how your business model is going to evolve and adapt to the changing landscape. So building on that sense of disruption, and that there are examples of that, understanding from a strategy perspective how you're going to perhaps one day be in the business of selling things B2B and then later move B2B to C, can show a lot of agility and present a number of new opportunities and change the growth story of the company. So things that we recommend you should avoid and what doesn't work is innovation tourism. So certainly running around Silicon Valley, collecting business cards, popping into to famous companies and things like that feels like you're doing something, but can be misleading and without clear objectives of what you want to accomplish, can leave you quite disappointed. Secondly, if this is something that you share only with a few people in the innovation or strategy teams, and it doesn't affect the business units, or it doesn't feel like it's something that top management is bought into, then it can be a non-starter. Thirdly, this isn't a silver bullet to make you just like a FANG company. You should think about how you can be the very best you, and not try and be another Facebook, Apple, Netflix, or Google. And then finally, this isn't a substitute for internal innovation or research programs. The best companies are interestingly good at doing both. They innovate internally, they have a creative culture. They're also able to do things with companies outside their organization. That comes either from culture, from being especially customer-centric, or other things that are defined by leadership. But certainly this isn't a substitute at all for that. So how to start? Think about how, I think we skipped a page. There we go. So the corporate disruptors toolkit. Again, this is something that only the CEO can help to truly activate, because while you might set it up, you won't get to some critical mass and adoption and appreciation in your company without that buy-in. And there's a spectrum here. There are things that are more focused, and there are things that have more optionality. And companies draw on this differently based on their culture. There are some companies that are very inventive, others that absorb ideas from the outside in different ways, and some that are very execution focused and want to like do things perhaps only at scale. And based on that, there are different things here that are emphasized or used more. But certainly your ability to build new things and incubate them internally if they have independence and an ability to challenge the core of the organization is good. The ability to buy and successfully integrate a company from the outside is very, very hard. But of course, for companies that can plug an acquired company into their distribution channel or turn on demand in unique ways, that can be very effective. There are companies that are very good at partnering through their culture or perhaps with particular technologies that they've got. And then, of course, there's the ability to invest, and that requires, again, a lot of that portfolio thinking and a board as well as a senior management team that wants to place a number of bets in order to both learn and to grow. So how to start? Well, think about how tools work together. And so there's a temptation to kind of open everything in the Swiss Army knife at the same time, but you probably get hurt doing that. So it may be, though, that if you were to use one or two of them in collaboration, you could do something successful. So imagine you're opening a wine bottle. You might need the blade at first and then the corkscrew. The same is true when you want to use different tools in this toolkit to invest, maybe to also host events and bring ideas from the outside, or think about how you would build internally and spin off if you do have, of course, the desire for a financial return. So again, what your company does well and the tools that work well for you are something that you can answer, and that companies that understand what they're good at and their limitations and how to harness that set of portfolio bets will do. How do we think about this? Well, we imagine there's a platform strategy that can provide a good approach to innovation here. So how to really do this? There's a bunch of steps here where at first you've got to sense, that is identifying the risks and opportunities for exploration. You want to learn where you can define and align those priorities. Test, so get good data back. And this is really a way in which you would apply the concepts of lean to a startup. And if you have a number of chosen areas and you are measuring things as we alluded to before, then you're able to learn. And then invest. So what are the strategic bets on a number of promising areas? And then finally accelerate. So double down on the things that you've tested and have gotten good metrics back on, or investing and feeling good about and getting good results back from. At 500, how we think about this is, startups, investors, and corporations need to be tied together very tightly. And the number of things that we do around this ecosystem, which we believe we can and should be building out, have to do with ideas like investor education, as Patrick described with our VC Unlock program that is coming up next in Berkeley. Things like Silicon Valley exchanges that can bring in ideas from outside your company. Accelerator programs that are very specific and measurable. A corporate VC program where folks have created that. Thinking about marketing sponsorships where you want to bring companies into your ecosystem, and we do that today with companies like Microsoft and Amazon. And then startup scouting, where you're actively looking at the landscape and trying to identify companies that can be beneficial to your own. So I'm going to stop right there and reserve our last 25 minutes here for questions. I'm sure there are a number coming in. So Patrick, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you curate those.
Sure. And remember, everybody who's participating, to use the Q&A function. I'm going to be reading questions from there, not from the chat function. And so thank you first to those folks who sent questions in beforehand. I do have a few that I think are pretty interesting. And one is if you could talk a little bit more, Vijay, about what corporates are doing a great job already and what are they doing and innovating, like VCs. Do you have any kind of lead-ins for those types of corps?
Excuse me. Absolutely. So there are a couple companies that are doing this really well. And again, they're not doing it in exactly the same way. And they're doing it in ways that speak to their own business realities, strategies, and so forth. So for example, if you think about GM today, GM, as folks who read our blog will know, has a mobility-related accelerator track with 500 startups. GM has an interest in sort of mining the startup ecosystem, finding great ideas. Certainly, they've made a number of acquisitions. Cruise is probably one of the most notable, and that is a 500 startups portfolio company. And then one of the important things that companies do is the type of people that they hire and promote and elevate into new roles is really important. And so the decision to move the president of GM over to be CEO of Cruise and be open and to accepting capital from outside is a really interesting model for open innovation, for transforming a huge and historic and historically important company through this approach. Very different company, and one that I know very well is BBVA. For folks that don't know BBVA, it's one of the world's most global banks, headquartered in Madrid, Spain, but with the majority of its revenue from emerging markets. It is a leading bank in many parts of the world, and one of the world's most digital banks as well. And that bank has had for many years a approach of how to build, buy, partner, and invest in many different startups and companies and funds, for that matter. In addition, you see, speaking of senior appointments, that the new executive chairman is a gentleman named Carlos Torres, who was originally head of the digital bank at BBVA. So certainly that digital disruption and innovation approaches is important there. And maybe a third example is, and again, a really different one, is Salesforce. If you think about Salesforce, Salesforce has a really great open innovation approach where a lot of software companies can be a part of their ecosystem in their app store, so to speak, as well as a really intense and high volume venture capital program, as well as a super customer centric program for how they work with their customers to develop new products. So again, going back to the example of how many of the best companies are getting to be good at how to innovate internally, as well as harness open innovation in a number of different ways.
Fantastic. All right, the next question we have from Megan Trite. And basically, she'd like to know what your thoughts on entrepreneurship programs are. And she's specifically interested in tool-centered models because of their ability to guide and develop ideas, and then to measure project successes afterwards. Do you have any insights in that?
Yeah, so one of the best things that comes out of entrepreneurship programs, and I assume this is for internal entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs, one of the best things that does is it really engages and motivates the workforce. So part of the outcome of digital transformation is a cultural transformation. And culture, as they say, eats strategy for breakfast. So if you can transform your culture and do it through entrepreneurship programs, you engage people, especially younger employees. You create an environment where people are given credit for coming up with side projects instead of just looking at a narrow set of OKRs. And that can be an awesome sense of engagement. In terms of how you want to measure that, there's a lot of opportunity and danger in how you measure things. So if you look at the number of ideas, then you may not get very impactful ones. And if you don't measure the ideas that come from different offices and geographies, you may just find that it's one group, one division, one place that you're engaging at the expense of others. So trying to make sure that you're measuring for impact, that is the number of projects that go from concept into some form of production or development, and try and look for conversion there, as well as, of course, the number of whether it's offices, branches, whatever it is that the company consists of that are involved, and whether there's manager sponsorship and promotion of the people who are doing this matters a great deal.
Great, thank you so much. And now we have a question from Constantine. So they would like to know what the critical element that CVC should focus on differently than traditional VCs. So can you quantify or qualify that?
Right. So CVCs are typically looking for strategic value, and that is really squishy. So it is being traditionally very hard to quantify. And there are some that are trying to look for financial and strategic returns. So how to measure the economic impact is something that I think strategy teams will continue to fight over. I think, and this is one opinion, if you look at partnerships or connections that were built between your portfolio and the business units, that's one measure. Of course, that means that sometimes you then have to create a CVC approach. That means, a million people need to sign off on a deal or it doesn't happen. But if you can hopefully separate the investment decision from all of the positive ways that you can impact the business unit, either with improving cybersecurity or improving top line or something like that, or launching new products or entering new markets or reaching new demographics, then that's really good. So it may not be a large percentage of the portfolio that gets engaged by the business units, but if we're measuring the impact and not the number or the percentage that work with the portfolio, then hopefully those are metrics with a positive strategic story.
Great. And the next question we have from Sean Young. Could you talk a little bit and provide examples of how 500 has helped some of these companies in terms of corporate innovation. So specific agendas or more details on kind of what 500 has created.
So 500 does a number of things, all the way from helping with insights and thinking about what the future is like, and how we might be able to showcase startups that are building that future, to active scouting and matchmaking for commercial, usually non-investment purposes, to how to engage teams to think about how they might become investors. And in some cases, there are a number of corporations that have chosen to invest in our either our global funds or our thematic funds that are around the world. So if I were to cherry pick some examples, there are companies that are engaging with us right now to think about different models from the future of mobility to how 5G is going to impact the landscape, to the changes in retail, and particularly after this holiday season, where we see a transformation of business models and hybrid business models, and in many of those cases, it's about us introducing people to the right startups, as well as kind of providing context and meaning there. So I think the things that you're able to see and appreciate in a tangible way that you don't get through reading things or just going to conferences, but rather need to get through through open innovation, whether it's through scouting activities or as an investor, are really valuable.
Okay, and so here's an interesting question. So basically, how can CVCs, since technically they are both competing and partnering with traditional VCs, if they are competing with them, what strategies should they incorporate to win the competition?
Yeah, so I tend to think on that spectrum from competition to cooperation, that the best CVCs lean much more towards cooperation than competition. If it becomes really competitive, then I think there's a question of whether that CVC is playing well in the ecosystem, so to speak. But it, rather than I think address the idea of winning and perhaps beating out a traditional like VC into the deal, there needs to be again a good thesis for why this investment makes sense, and of course a value proposition. So just like every VC will argue that they have a platform and resources that are going to be highly beneficial to that future portfolio company, crafting your own story about what it is you bring to the table, and making sure that it is accurate and of course something you can deliver on is super important, both for your credibility in the market and for the ability to be a good strategic investor. Perhaps one of the things that CVCs should avoid doing, and this could help them to be in more deals than not, is to avoid terms that will sound either exclusive or restrictive in the engagement with the startup, because particularly if you're going after a big market with a number of B2B clients, you don't want to be trapped in the world or the ecosystem of that one CVC's parent company. Rather, you'd want to have relationships with a number of firms in the industry. So that's one way in which CVCs can at least avoid shooting themselves in the foot.
Great. Yeah, and finding that balance between competing and partnership is always important. So a question from Daniel Ginter is, how do we help accelerate corporate leadership's change of mentality and culture to foster intrapreneurship and entrepreneurship and create the necessary processes and any sort of new kind of decision making? So any recommendations for that, changing the culture?
Yeah, I mean, changing the culture has a number of elements to it. Again, the types of small programs that you might introduce can help change the culture. And we talked about how internal entrepreneurial programs do that. In terms of the widespread culture, sometimes incubating and working with companies require a new compliance standard. It requires different onboarding for vendors. All those things require a different way of working, a different process, a rethinking of why we do things a certain way. And when that results in a different behavior, then culture starts to change. And that's one of the benefits of open innovation. It probably feels disruptive, painful, annoying at the time, but it can be hugely beneficial to always be doing some of those things. And I think to make the different support and control functions in a company feel that they have a stake in this and that they are beneficiaries and seeing cool things up front can make a huge difference. What usually tends to happen is if you can find a person that's itching to do something a little bit differently, make this something that they can take on and be the ambassador of those different teams or divisions, then they are usually able to carry back a message that evangelizes for you as an innovator, and then those friendlies are of course able to over time become a guiding team and a group that can shape new things in the organization. That being said, it's really, really hard, and it takes a lot of time, and you have to give it time to evolve. So I would say that on top of what we've already emphasized in terms of the role of top management and the kinds of people that are hired, promoted, and advanced, and the responsibilities they get, certainly around innovation and digital transformation.
Great. Now an interesting question from Ricardo Altman. How about integration of HR from kind of a startup culture into a corporate structure once you start making acquisitions of startups after a Series B, for example?
So the question is, when is the right time to acquire startups, and should that be after a Series B?
And kind of integrating HR, like human resource strategies, from the startup mentality versus a corporate structure.
Right. So it's very easy to acquire a company and suffocate it. And certainly there are companies that have made post-merger integration into an art form. Cisco is one that comes to mind in terms of trying to preserve what's good and bring it into the core. Another model is you create a new future business unit, and you can acquire the startups and put them in there. And then they have a separate unit in which they can continue acting like a startup, growing fast and having less, red tape and decision-making channels. And so I think either of those works, but something in the middle is extremely destructive of value. And so HR is an important dimension, because certainly the types of people that are attracted to a startup and to certain kinds of projects are going to be different than the folks that are attracted to the main company, and particularly that includes the ways in which they are incented, and the way they like to work, the rules that they want, perhaps the way they like to dress, hours they want to work, whatever it is. And so whether there is an easy assimilation, or whether there is a sort of protected space, one of those can help.
Great. It seems like every one question that we answer, 3 more come in. So we're going to have to eventually wrap up. And I think maybe we can get to 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll go from there. Does that sound good, Vijay?
Sounds good.
Great. So this is a question that is comparing what is the better bet for corporations: obtaining or acquiring startups, or doing some sort of entrepreneurship internal spinouts. Could you talk a little bit more about the cost benefits between both of those operational techniques?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily a choice, because I've seen companies that do both, but it has to do with the types of options that you have, and the landscape of companies that you see. And what do I mean by that? If you're going to build things internally, perhaps you should be the builder of last resort. Maybe there are companies you can't see or invest in on the outside, and you should build that business yourself. Alternatively, you may have a culture that is highly execution oriented, and likes doing things at scale. You know how to roll something out to 2,000 stores, but you can't do a pop-up in 3. Like, those are very real, and to kind of be aware of oneself and and in this case one's company, is super important. So if it turns out that you are only really good at scaling things, or operating at scale, rather than going from 0 to 1, then it can make more sense to invest or acquire, and then plug that acquired company into a highly efficient distribution channel or what have you, than to try and start small and expand a really new team and try and take things from MVP and up. Cool. I think we have time for 1 more question.
Sure. All right, let's see. So here is a question from Dan Kahn, and oftentimes when he's speaking with startups, they want the distribution resources and benefits of big corporations, but the investment is way too restrictive for them in subsequent fundraising and acquisition discussions. As a corporation who would like to invest, but they're not ready to fully acquire, what advice should you give to someone like Dan who still wants to speak to startups, or what approach should they take?
Yeah, so I think the best thing is to be like really upfront in terms of like, this is what we can invest in, whether you can or can't lead a deal, whether there is appetite or dry powder from the board to be able to make acquisitions, and sometimes just having that clarity up front leads to a better conversation, because cards are on the table, and that startup then gets some clarity in terms of what your intentions are, and maybe there is another way in which you work together from a BD and not necessarily a corp dev standpoint. The worst thing that any corporation or any innovation leader or any VC can do is waste a founder's time, because that's all they have is a very limited runway and time to execute. So your reputation and respect in the market will be better for saying this is what we can and can't do. Maybe there's something here, and if not, that's okay. There could be other ways to work together in the future, and you can keep the relationship warm. So that would be my advice there. And if now is not the right time, and later things change, you'll be in a good position and respected enough to get back in the flow of things.
All right, thank you so much, Vijay. There are a few questions that ask specifically about becoming VCs, and I'd like to replug and for everyone who's participating in the webinar to remember Deal Camp at Berkeley. And again, that's our 4-day course. It's focused kind of on the technical side of deal making, cap tables, term sheets, etc. And if you want to learn about how to become a VC or how to incorporate venture capital in your corporate, feel free to reach out with any questions to vcunlocked@500.co. Thank you all so much. And again, this is Patrick Driscoll with 500 Startups, the education operations. And with that, Vijay, do you have any other things you'd like to mention? Or
if folks want to continue this conversation, tweet at me, email me. Happy to talk, and either myself or someone from our team will do our best to answer any questions or share more about 500.
Great, and I do have all of these questions that we weren't able to get to saved, and we'll try to get back to you in many of those questions. Again, thank you everyone. Deal Camp at Berkeley, February 11th to the 14th. And thanks a lot, Vijay, and I hope to hear back from everyone soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.